Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I started setting up the yard sale earlier than I normally would have, mostly because I didn't sleep well the night before. The weather report had promised a clear morning, and Northeast Baltimore can get busy on weekends, so I figured it was better to drag myself outside before the sun had fully risen. At around 6:45, the street was still quiet. The air had that damp, chilled feeling that comes just before the temperature decides which direction it wants to go for the day. My driveway still held shadows, and only a few of the neighborhood birds had started making noise. I carried out folding tables, an old box of kitchen tools, a bin of winter clothes I didn't need anymore, and a couple of boxes full of things I had finally convinced myself to get rid of. None of it was priced yet. I hadn't even opened half the boxes. I was bent over adjusting the legs of one of the tables when I heard footsteps. Not the casual kind you hear from early joggers or dog walkers, but measured steps that sounded like they were directed straight toward me. When I looked up, a man was already halfway up my driveway, heading toward me with a kind of certainty that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I knew instantly that he wasn't there to browse. He had no interest in anything I had placed out so far. His eyes weren't scanning the tables or boxes. They were locked on me. There was something tense in the way he walked, like he was late for something important, or like he had rehearsed this moment. He stopped only a few feet away. His clothes looked like he had slept in them. Dark jeans with worn creases, a gray hoodie that had stains running down the sleeves, and old shoes that had seen too many wet days. His face was pale, unshaven, and his expression didn't change even as I stood up and tried to figure out if I had met him somewhere before. I didn't recognize him. His skin had that sallow, tired look of someone who stayed up through the night, and the heavy smell of old cigarette smoke drifted off him the moment the breeze shifted. There was no browsing, no greeting. He stared at me steadily. I could see his chest rise and fall a little too quickly, like he had come here angry or impatient. I wondered if he had mistaken my house for someone else's. Yard sales on this street weren't uncommon, and I knew the houses could blur together if you weren't paying attention. But there was something in the way he looked at me that made it clear he thought he was in the right place. His eyes never left mine, and the directness of that stare made me freeze. He asked if I still had the red box. The words came out low and flat. I didn't understand what he meant. I had no red box. I didn't have anything in my possession that could even loosely be described that way. I hadn't advertised any specific item online. I hadn't talked to anyone about special items or preparations. I tried to explain with a small, confused gesture, but he just kept staring. There was no shift in his expression, no sign of confusion on his part. It was as if he thought I was hiding something, withholding something he absolutely believed belonged here. He repeated the question, but more slowly, like he was trying to force clarity out of repetition alone. The weight of his stare made me feel like the air had thickened around us. Even the neighborhood felt too quiet, like the entire street had paused to watch what would happen next. I noticed his right hand kept hovering near the front pocket of his hoodie. He pressed his fingers against something inside the pocket, adjusting it the way someone might check a phone or a wallet, except this didn't feel casual at all. It made my stomach drop. I backed up a little because something in the situation was shifting in a direction that didn't feel safe. He noticed immediately. He moved with me, closing the space between us again. The driveway felt too open, and I suddenly became aware of how alone I was out there. Most of the neighbors who usually woke early were probably still inside, drinking coffee or getting ready for the day. No one was looking outside. No one was paying attention. The sun was just starting to rise over the roofs across the street, but it wasn't bright enough yet to make me feel secure. I stepped toward my porch, hoping to create some distance. He followed, keeping his focus locked on me. Each step he took felt deliberate, like he had already made up his mind about how this encounter was supposed to go. I kept expecting him to question himself, to realize he had made a mistake and retreat down the driveway, but he didn't. His hand moved inside the pocket again, and I caught the slight shape of something hard pressing against the fabric. My heartbeat picked up fast enough for me to feel it in my throat. By the time I reached the first step of my porch, I felt cornered. The air smelled like wet concrete and cigarettes. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I also knew that standing still wasn't an option. I could feel the door behind me, the reassurance of the lock, and the proximity of my phone inside the house. I was close enough to safety, but not close enough to relax. Then he pulled his hand out of the pocket. For a split second, I thought maybe he was going to show me some kind of proof that he had the wrong person, maybe a photo or an address scribbled on paper. But instead, I saw the dark handle of a folding knife in his palm. He didn't open it. He just held it loosely. The way someone holds an object they want you to notice without having to say anything. His thumb tapped the handle slowly, rhythmically, as if he was signaling that he didn't need to flip the blade open to make a point. That was the moment fear hit me in a way that felt almost physical. I turned, ran inside, and slammed the door. My hands shook hard as I locked it. I could hear the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears. The house felt too quiet. I didn't move away from the door immediately. I stood there, waiting to hear footsteps leaving, but he didn't walk off right away. Through the small window above the door, I could see the top of his hoodie as he stood on the porch. Perfectly still. I didn't dare make noise. I didn't want him to think I was doing anything inside. He stayed there for what felt longer than it probably was, about a minute, but the pressure of that minute stretched out until every second felt distinct. Then he finally walked down the steps slowly, like he didn't feel the need to hurry. He didn't look back. He just drifted down the driveway and disappeared around the corner of the street. I canceled the yard sale. I didn't even bother moving the tables back inside at first. I just sat near the front window, checking the street every few minutes, waiting to see if he returned. He never did. No one else came that morning. I didn't talk to any of the neighbors about it. It didn't feel like the kind of thing that would make sense when spoken out loud. For days afterward, I kept replaying the encounter, trying to figure out who he thought I was. I wondered if someone had set him up, or if he had been given an address by mistake. I thought about the words he had used and tried to picture what sort of situation would involve a red box being exchanged at a yard sale. Nothing I imagined made me feel any better. Nothing was innocent. Everything I came up with involved money, drugs, stolen items, or something worse. I eventually stopped trying to understand it because each possibility made the scene on my porch feel even more real than it already was. I replaced the lock on my door the following week. I moved a motion light to the front porch. I started paying attention to unfamiliar cars on the street. I learned what normal sounds belonged to my neighborhood and what sounds didn't. I thought the fear would fade with time, but instead it just settled into a quieter place inside me, becoming something I think about whenever I step outside early in the morning. To this day, I have no idea who that man believed I was or what he expected to find in that red box. All I know is that he arrived fully convinced he would leave with something important, and when I couldn't give it to him, something in him shifted just enough for me to see what might have happened if I hadn't reached the door in time. I still think about that moment, the tapping of his thumb on the knife handle, the steady way he stared, and the silent minute he spent on my porch before walking away like nothing had happened. It changed the way I look at early mornings, strangers, and even something as simple as a yard sale. I had the yard sale on a Saturday morning in late September, the kind of morning when the air feels cold at first but warms quickly once the sun clears the houses. My place in Cedar Rapids sits on a quiet street where most people keep to themselves. I had cleared out a lot of old things during the week, boxes from the basement, a few tools, some clothes, and a small plastic baby monitor I hadn't touched in years. I didn't even remember where it originally came from. It was one of those two-piece sets with a receiver and a transmitter, both scratched from being shoved into storage bins, both yellowed slightly from age. A woman showed up earlier than most people, around 8. She looked to be in her mid-40s, thin, with hair tied back in a way that made her face look longer than it probably was. She moved quietly through the tables, barely glancing at anything else. She pointed at the monitor, asked if it worked, and I told her it had the last time I used it. She paid in cash, 5 crumpled $1 bills, and left without browsing anything else. It didn't seem strange at the time. People buy odd things at yard sales. I didn't think about her again. 2 days passed normally. It was one of those stretches of early fall when evenings cool down fast, and the house feels a little too quiet after dark. I kept busy with work, laundry, and some leftover cleaning from the sale. The baby monitor wasn't on my mind. I had cleared the tables, boxed up the unsold things, and dropped everything else at a donation center. The weekend already felt distant. On the second night after the sale, I woke up suddenly at 3:11 in the morning. The number stuck with me because my alarm clock glowed it bright and sharp in the dark room. I wasn't dreaming, at least not that I could remember. It was a noise that woke me, a thin sound, high and strained, carrying through the stillness of the house. I lay still for a few seconds trying to figure out what it was, wondering if it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor's kid crying through an open window. But it didn't sound far away. It sounded close, too close for comfort. The noise faded for a moment, then came back louder, a clear wailing cry. It startled me upright. I don't have kids, I live alone. Nothing should have been making that sound anywhere inside my walls. I got out of bed and stood there, letting my ears adjust. The house was dark, but the crying continued in short, uneven bursts. It wasn't echoing, it wasn't muffled. It was coming from one distinct spot. I walked slowly down the hall toward the kitchen, trying to stay calm even though my chest felt tight. The crying grew sharper as I reached the doorway. The sound was coming from the baby monitor sitting on my kitchen counter. The same monitor I had sold. There it was, placed neatly near the fruit bowl, the plastic casing dull in the faint glow from the stove clock. The crying filtered through it, thin, distorted, but unmistakably a baby. My first thought made no sense. I sold that thing. It shouldn't have been there. And it wasn't plugged in. It had no batteries in it. I remembered taking them out before boxing it for the sale, because they were corroded. It shouldn't have been able to make any noise at all. I stood there longer than I should have, frozen in the doorway, staring at the thing. The crying suddenly cut off mid-sound, leaving the house in complete silence again. No static followed, no humming, just nothing. My hands were shaking when I reached for it. It was colder than the surrounding air, like it had been sitting outside. I turned it over in my hands, checked the underside, the battery compartment, the switches. Everything was exactly as it had been when I sold it. Empty battery slot, loose back plate that didn't sit quite right. There was nothing logical about it, but I was too unsettled to think clearly. I set the monitor down on its back, stepped away from it, and walked the entire downstairs with all the lights on. I checked the back door, the windows, the garage entrance, every room, every closet. Everything was locked. Everything looked untouched. I barely slept the rest of the night. I lay awake listening for any kind of noise, any sign that something was wrong inside the house. Each time the fridge kicked on or the vents shifted, I felt my whole body tense up. Nothing else happened, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. In the morning, after pacing around the kitchen with a cup of coffee I didn't finish, I went to check the porch camera. I almost didn't want to. Something about the monitor showing up again felt deliberate. I opened the camera app and scrolled back to the early morning hours. At 1:40 a.m., the woman from the yard sale appeared at the far edge of the driveway, walking slowly up toward my porch. She carried something in her hands held close to her chest. She wasn't hunched or frantic, just moving deliberately, like she had done this sort of thing before. She walked up the porch steps, knelt, placed the monitor on the wooden boards near the mat, and then stood and looked directly into the camera. She didn't smile. She didn't look confused or startled by the camera. She just stared for a long moment. Then she turned away and walked back down the driveway until she disappeared into the dark. I replayed the clip several times, each run making me feel worse. She had come onto my porch without hesitation. She knew exactly where to place the monitor, and she had brought it back sometime between when I went to bed and when the crying woke me. I turned the footage over to the police later that day. I drove it down myself because I didn't want to wait for someone to come out. They listened while I explained everything, though I left out the detail about the crying coming from an unpowered monitor. I didn't know how to say that without sounding unstable. I only told them she returned the item and trespassed on my property. They took the footage politely and said they would review it, but I could tell they didn't think it would lead anywhere. They were right. A few days passed with no update, then a week. They eventually said they couldn't identify her from the video alone, and since she hadn't caused damage or tried to enter the house, it didn't meet the threshold for anything further. The case stalled. I tried moving on, but the whole situation stayed under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. The woman's expression on the camera wasn't angry or confused. It was blank, like she was waiting for something she didn't get. The crying from the monitor replayed in my mind at random moments. The sharp, strained sound of a baby that didn't exist in my house. I tried to reason it out, thinking maybe it picked up a stray radio frequency or interference from somewhere, but the fact that the device had no power made that explanation fall apart every time. After a lot of thinking, I came up with the only explanation that fit the real-world details, even if it didn't make me feel any better. That monitor must have still had some faint residual charge, or some odd internal fault, allowing it to make noise briefly if jolted, shaken, or handled the right way. And the crying wasn't a real-time sound. It was a leftover recorded loop or glitch built up from its older use. Something it picked up years back and never truly cleared. When she brought it back and set it on the porch, maybe the movement triggered it. Maybe when I lifted it in the kitchen, the last bit of whatever signal it had left played out. But that didn't explain why she brought it back at all. The only reason I settled on, and the only one that fully made sense, was that she realized after taking it home that it behaved strangely, maybe in the same way it did for me. Maybe it made a noise in her house in the middle of the night and scared her enough that she wanted it gone immediately. And maybe she didn't want to confront me or explain anything. She just wanted to return it the fastest way possible. After considering that, the situation grew less mysterious, but not less disturbing. I still think about her face on the porch camera sometimes, that blank expression, the way she stared into the lens before leaving. She didn't knock. She didn't leave a note. She just returned something she clearly didn't want. I got rid of the monitor the same day I received the police call saying they couldn't do anything else. I didn't sell it again. I didn't donate it. I took it apart into pieces and put it in separate trash bags. I didn't want anyone else bringing it back to me. That night, for the first time since the incident, I slept without waking. The house stayed quiet. No strange noises, no crying. Only the normal rhythm of a place settling after dark. I still check the porch camera every morning, though. It's become a habit I can't shake, even when I know nothing will be there. Sometimes the simplest things from the past have a way of echoing longer than they should. I held the yard sale late in the day because the heat and temp had been brutal all week, and I figured the evening light would make things more bearable. By 7:50 p.m., the sun had dropped behind the buildings across the street, leaving the condo complex in that dim, dusty kind of half-light that appears right before full night. The concrete still held on to the day's warmth, radiating it back through my sandals as I packed up the last bits of what hadn't sold. The air felt heavy, like it always does in late summer when there's no breeze and the heat just sits there without moving. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead with the back of my arm, gathering a stack of old picture frames, and thinking I should have ended everything earlier. Most people had already come and gone by then. A few families, a couple of students from down the street, one older man who'd spent 10 minutes inspecting a broken lamp. By the time the sky had taken on a shadowy blue hue, the complex felt unusually quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic on Rural Road and the occasional slam of a car door from somewhere deeper in the lot. I had a box of dishes, some random utensils, and a blender I never used sitting near the edge of my driveway. I was reaching down to fold the flaps of a cardboard box when I noticed someone approaching. He came from the direction of the sidewalk, walking slowly, his head down, a gray hoodie pulled up tight around his face, even though the air was still hot enough to make the back of my shirt stick to my skin. The hoodie struck me first. No one wears one in that kind of heat unless they're trying to hide something. His hands stayed deep in the pockets, and he walked with this flat, steady step, like he wasn't browsing or passing by, but heading specifically toward me. I remember straightening up and giving a polite nod, trying not to show that he'd put me on edge. He didn't look at me at first. He just let his eyes slide over the items still out, landing briefly on the kitchenware box. He finally looked at me, and there was something strange about the way he did it. Not curious, not friendly, more like he was sizing me up, taking inventory. He asked if I had anything military-related. When I shook my head, he didn't respond. He didn't even pretend to browse. He just shifted his weight slightly and stared at the open box beside my foot. I could feel sweat running down my spine, not from the heat, but from the sudden discomfort of having him there. There was something off about the way he stood. Too close, but not close enough to call out as inappropriate. Still, he never backed away. The light was fading fast, the sky turning a darker shade by the minute. Porch lights were flickering on across the complex, little warm squares against the growing blue. I kept moving items around to look busy, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, he started watching me more closely. His face was mostly hidden in the shadow of the hood, but I could see enough to know he wasn't smiling or showing any normal sign of interest. Just staring. Then he shifted his gaze toward the front of my condo. He looked at my balcony, my door, the small walkway leading to the back gate. He didn't ask anything directly at first. He just let his eyes linger on every part of the property like he was studying it. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my neck. I kept trying to wrap up quickly, sliding boxes closer to the garage, stacking things haphazardly. At some point, without really planning it, I blurted out something about having a roommate inside. I lifted my head and called up toward the empty balcony, pretending to talk to someone who wasn't there. It was obvious, maybe even ridiculous, but I didn't care. I needed the idea of another person to exist, even if only in his mind. Nothing about him changed outwardly, but I felt something shift, like the air itself tightened. He looked at my balcony again and then back at me, but he didn't move away. The longer he stood there, the more I felt pinned in place. I hated that I had answered him earlier when he asked if I lived alone. It had slipped out without thinking, the way you answer a casual question from a normal shopper. But he wasn't a normal shopper, and the realization hit me too late. Eventually he walked off, heading toward the parking lot like he didn't have a purpose or destination. I didn't move until he disappeared behind one of the cars. Even then, something in my gut told me not to relax. I hurried through packing, my hands shaking slightly as I shoved the remaining items into boxes. The shadows were deeper now. The last of the natural light was draining away, leaving everything tinted by porch lights and the dim orange glow of the lot lamps. When I bent down to grab a crate, I noticed him again. He'd circled back, appearing halfway down the driveway, pretending to look at the same kitchen items he had ignored the first time. He didn't touch anything. He didn't speak. He just hovered there, staring at the box like he needed an excuse to stand near me again. When I tried to act busy, he didn't leave. He only drifted away when I finally started dragging boxes into the garage, making it clear I was done for the night. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I worked. Between one armload of boxes and the next, I realized he was back again, further away this time near the edge of the parking lot. He wasn't pretending to browse anymore. He was watching my building, standing still, head slightly angled up toward my unit as if memorizing it. By the time I locked the front door behind me, I could feel my hands trembling. I waited inside with the lights off for a few minutes, peeking through the blinds to see if he was still there. He was. He lingered near the corner of a car, leaning slightly against the bumper like he had every reason to be in the lot. He stayed until full darkness settled in. Only then did he finally slip out of sight. I reported everything to the management office the next morning. I expected them to shrug it off, or tell me they couldn't do anything without more information. Instead, the woman at the desk said she would pass it on to maintenance and keep an eye out for anything similar. I didn't expect anything to come from it. People wander through complexes all the time. A week later, I was bringing groceries in when one of my neighbors from the next building caught me outside. She mentioned that someone matching the same description had been out late at night, pulling on door handles and checking back gates. Maintenance had chased him off once, but he had returned 2 nights later. She said he walked with that same slow, steady step, wearing the same gray hoodie, head down. When she described the posture, the way he moved, the way he lingered near doors as if deciding something, I felt the same cold drop in my stomach that I'd felt that evening. In the days after, management brought in extra security patrols. I noticed more lights being replaced, more reminders sent out about locking gates and reporting suspicious activity. The complex felt on edge, but also more aware. And as unsettling as it all was, there was a strange comfort in knowing I hadn't imagined it. Someone else had seen him. Someone else had felt that same sense of unease. He never came back after that second week, or if he did, no one saw him. The patrols eventually went back to normal. Life in the complex returned to its usual rhythm. Still, every time I walk to my car at night or hear footsteps outside my window, I think of that moment when I told him I lived alone and instantly wished I could take the words back. I think of the way he stood in the lot watching my building, calculating something I never wanted to understand. I stopped holding yard sales after that. I stopped lingering outside at dusk. And every night, before I lock the door, I check the parking lot from my window, making sure there isn't a figure in a gray hoodie, standing just far enough away to pretend he belongs there. I bought the cardboard box of old VHS tapes on a warm Saturday morning in late August, the kind of morning when Placer Street in Reading felt half asleep. The yard sale was small, set up in the patchy front lawn of a faded ranch-style house with a sagging gutter and a couple of sun-bleached plastic chairs near the driveway. Nothing about it looked promising, but I stopped anyway because I've always had a habit of digging through yard sales for odd horror tapes. Most times I find nothing interesting, just old home videos or worn-out cartoons, but every once in a while something rare turns up, and that possibility keeps me stopping at every cardboard sign taped to a telephone pole. The box was sitting under a folding table, half hidden behind a crate of mismatched kitchenware. It was an old produce box with a torn label on the side. Inside were maybe 20 tapes, all dusty, some with peeling stickers, most unlabeled. They looked like they'd been stored in a garage for years. The whole box was $5, and that kind of price overrides hesitation. I paid, carried the box to my car, and didn't think anything of it. It felt like every other spontaneous yard sale purchase I'd made before. When I got home, I left the box on the living room floor for a while and went about my afternoon. Only later, when the shadows in the house had shifted and the day felt quieter, did I start going through the tapes. Most were things like cheap action movies recorded off old TV broadcasts, a wedding from 1997, a few episodes of some forgotten sitcom. The unlabeled one was wedged between two clamshell cases. The tape was plain black, no writing on the spine or the front. It felt heavier for some reason, maybe from the dust or just because it stood out. I slid it into the VCR more out of routine than expectation. The screen flickered, lines rolled, and then it settled into the beginning of the footage without any title screen or sound. For the first minute or so I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It was dark, and the image shifted in that shaky, grainy way that only old handheld cameras do. Slowly the scene sharpened: a sidewalk, the edge of a curb, the glow of a streetlight. The person holding the camera was walking. The light from the camcorder beam jumped across driveways and lawns like the person was scanning each one. The footage had that eerie quiet that only exists in residential neighborhoods after midnight, when even the insects seem soft. At first I thought it might have been someone recording Christmas lights, or some kind of neighborhood event, but the date stamp in the corner didn't match any holiday. And the camera wasn't focused on decorations or anything notable. Whoever was filming was walking slowly down unfamiliar streets, angling the camera toward houses in a way that felt too deliberate to be random. Every few seconds the light paused on a window or a front porch before moving on. By the fourth minute, I felt a prickle of unease. The way the person walked was steady, controlled, as if they had a route. The beam sometimes lingered on open garages or side yards. The person never spoke. Their footsteps were soft and careful, barely registering over the low hum of the tape. As minute 9 came around, I realized how long 16 minutes of silent night walking actually felt. I kept watching because the tape had crossed the line from odd to unsettling. My living room felt still, and I noticed I was sitting forward without meaning to. At minute 13, the houses looked vaguely familiar. The spacing between them, the slope of the lawns, Even the angle of the street felt like it could have been somewhere on the east side of town. I tried to place it, telling myself I was connecting dots that weren't there. But the sense of recognition only grew. The person filming moved toward a house with a pale exterior that caught the camera beam in a washed-out glow. The driveway held a blue truck with a dent in the rear quarter panel. The camcorder light settled on that dent like the person filming wanted to capture every detail. My chest tightened before my mind fully accepted what I was seeing. The house was mine, not current day. There were too many differences, but unquestionably the same structure. The roofline, the windows, the porch posts, even the tree on the right side of the yard, thinner and shorter than it is now. The blue truck wasn't mine, which made sense because I hadn't lived here then. The date in the corner told me it was filmed 5 years earlier. The camera zoomed slightly, like the person holding it wanted a closer look at the front door. Then the tape cut to static. No ending, no return to normal footage. Just a sudden stop. I sat there long after the static filled the room. The air felt wrong, too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I replayed the last minutes of footage in my head, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe the house just looked similar to mine. Maybe the tree happened to grow into the same shape. Maybe the porch posts were a common style. I tried every possible excuse, but the truth sat there like dead weight. The tape showed my house years before I ever saw the listing online. I hardly slept that night. I kept listening for sounds outside, wondering if someone had ever stood on my street like that, filming other houses the same way. My house had a previous owner who moved to Oregon, and I'd barely thought about them since moving in. Now I wondered who they were, what kind of life they had, and whether they ever knew someone had recorded their house under cover of darkness. The next morning I took the box of tapes back to the house on Placer Street. The yard sale was still going, though the crowd was smaller. The same folding tables were out, covered with clothes and mugs and old tools. I carried the box up the driveway, and the people running the sale looked confused to see me return with it. They didn't ask why. They just waited while I set the box down and tried to explain where I'd gotten it and what was inside. They said the tapes were donated by an older man who had passed away earlier that summer. They didn't know his name offhand, only that his daughter had dropped off several boxes of things to clear out his storage unit. They apologized in that vague, polite way people do when they don't know what else to say. There was nothing for them to offer. They took the box back, assuming I wanted a refund, but I walked away before they could hand me anything. I didn't want the money. I just didn't want the tape in my house another night. For several days afterward, I kept replaying that footage in my mind with small details sharpening each time. The angle of the camera, the slow pace of the walk, the way the light stayed on the blue truck for a moment too long. I wondered who the older man was, what his habits had been, and why he would have a tape like that. Maybe he had been documenting crime in the neighborhood. Maybe he had been paranoid and thought filming houses would give him proof of something only he believed. Or maybe someone else had given him that tape years earlier, something he never watched or never wanted to deal with. It could have been passed from hand to hand without anyone knowing what was on it. The clearest possibility was the simplest: someone had filmed my house because they were watching the previous owners, maybe even planning something. But nothing ever happened. No break-ins, no suspicious reports. Nothing in the home's history that would suggest an incident. Whoever filmed the place must have moved on or lost interest. That thought was both comforting and unsettling. It meant the danger had likely passed. But it also meant someone once stood where I now park my car, staring at the house through a camcorder like they were waiting for something. The explanation I settled on was the only one that fit the details. The older man who donated the tapes had been a quiet, solitary person according to the neighbors who remembered him. It wasn't impossible that he had developed a habit of late night walks with a camcorder, maybe as a way to cope with loneliness or insomnia. People develop strange routines when they have too much time alone, and filming empty streets might have been something that gave him structure. Maybe he filmed every house on his route, not because he meant harm, but because it became a ritual. My house just happened to be along his path 5 years before I ever laid eyes on it. It wasn't a comforting conclusion, but it was a complete one, and it kept me from spiraling into worse theories. Over time, the feeling of unease faded, replaced by a kind of distant curiosity. I never went back to ask for more information about the man, and I didn't try to find his daughter. I let the story end where it naturally did. The tape never returned to my house, and I've avoided yard sale VHS boxes ever since. But sometimes, late at night when the street outside is silent, I think about how many forgotten tapes are out there, sitting in old boxes or storage units, holding moments of someone's life that no one ever meant to share. And I think about how easily those moments can land in the hands of someone who was never meant to see them. I had the yard sale with my sister on a warm Saturday morning in Fayetteville, the kind of morning where the light comes in soft and gold, before the sun gets high enough to turn everything harsh. We dragged half the contents of my garage onto the driveway, spreading things out on old folding tables I'd borrowed from a neighbor. Most of it was the usual mix of forgotten belongings and items we hadn't used in years. A few boxes of books, some mismatched dishes, an old floor lamp, a stack of DVDs. My sister had brought a few things she didn't want in her apartment anymore. Among everything, that old leather wallet sat near the edge of the center table, the one we put smaller items on. It had belonged to my grandfather, but it didn't hold any emotional meaning for either of us. Just soft brown leather, worn around the edges, a faint crease where it had been folded for years. No ID, no photos, no money, just a shell of a wallet. People started showing up around 8. Most were friendly enough. A few came early, that type who arrive before you've even finished setting up, picking through boxes while you're still placing things out. The older man in the denim jacket didn't show up until around 9. He walked slowly, staring in a way that made me think he was trying to memorize everything before touching anything. He had gray stubble along his jaw and a deep line running across his forehead, the kind etched in from years of squinting or worrying. He drifted around the tables like he had nowhere else to be, but his attention kept snapping back to the wallet. He'd pick it up, run his thumb across the fold, set it down again, walk a few feet away, then return as if he needed to check that it was still there. I noticed my sister watching him too. She stood near the clothes rack, folding a shirt someone had left unfolded, her eyes flicking toward him in a way that told me she felt the same odd stiffness in the air. There wasn't anything obviously wrong with him. He didn't smell strange or act unstable. But there was something uneasy in the way his jaw kept clenching, as if he was waiting for us to say something specific and we were failing. He finally paid for the wallet with a crumpled 5, the bill damp as if he had been holding it in his palm for too long. He didn't say thank you or make small talk. He just walked off down the driveway, the wallet in his hand, holding it like a fragile piece of evidence instead of a cheap old accessory. I remember the way the sun hit his jacket, bringing out the faded streaks in the denim as he stepped into the street. An hour passed. The usual yard sale crowd thinned out. It was nearing noon and the heat was climbing. I just lifted a box of old tools to move them into the shade when I looked up and saw the same man walking back up the driveway. He moved with a different energy now. Something hard and fixed in his expression. His face was red, not from the heat but from something boiling under the surface. There were no greetings or questions. Just a heavy, quiet anger. He stood close enough that I could see the incredulous look in his eyes, as if I had done something unthinkable to him. His attention kept darting toward my garage, the wide open door showing the leftover clutter inside. I felt my stomach tense in a way that made me shift my weight without realizing it. The man looked like someone searching through a memory, trying to place the exact moment something had gone wrong. My sister came over from the driveway, probably picking up on the tension. Her steps were controlled and steady. She always had that ability, moving like she had prepared herself before walking into something. His eyes jumped to her when she approached, and something in his posture changed, a tightening in the shoulders, a lift in the chin. He began looking from her to me, then back to the garage again. The heat felt suddenly thicker, like the air had tightened around us. I didn't know what he thought we had done. There hadn't been anything in the wallet. I had checked it that morning while arranging things, flipping it open just to see if anything old and forgotten had been left inside. But the man looked at us like he was certain. His hands were shaking a little, not from age but from the kind of anger that comes from feeling wronged. He took a slow step back at one point, not leaving but repositioning himself so he could watch both of us and the garage at the same time, his breathing shallow and uneven. My sister stayed planted in the same spot, her presence steady but tense. I could see the way her hands hung at her sides, fingers flexing, the same way they always did when she felt cornered or threatened. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture. She just stood firm, waiting for the moment to pass, waiting for him to take the hint and go. Eventually he backed away down the driveway. Not in defeat, not in confusion, but in a deliberate, slow retreat, like he was conceding one moment so he could plan for another. He turned at the bottom of the driveway, walked across the street, and got into a faded blue pickup parked under the maple tree. The passenger window was cracked open a little, and he sat inside with his hands gripping the wheel, staring at the front of my house as if he were studying every window. The yard sale ended early. Hard to keep a cheerful mood when someone is parked across the street staring with the kind of fixed focus that makes your shoulders tense. We started boxing things up, tossing unsold items back in the garage without caring much about organization. Every time I carried a box toward the house, I felt his eyes on me, not just watching what I was doing, but tracking my movements like he was waiting for something to slip, something to reveal itself. 3 hours passed before he finally drove away. Not fast, not slow, just steady, the way someone leaves only after they have gathered all the information they need. My sister left soon after, both of us assuming it was over. But when I went inside, I noticed right away that the side gate was cracked open. I always latch it because the hinge sags, and if it isn't shut tight the wood scrapes against the ground and leaves a clear trail in the dirt. The trail was visible now, fresh lines in the thin layer of dust on the stepping stones. The footprints were even fresher, pressed deep enough that the edges still crumbled when I crouched to look at them. They led straight to the small basement window near the back corner of the house, the one partly shielded by the shrub I hadn't trimmed in months. The window had smudges on the glass, long streaks like someone had leaned close and steadied themselves with a hand. I walked the perimeter of the house twice, checking the door locks 3 times, trying to convince myself that he'd only walked around and looked. No forced entry, no broken glass, nothing out of place inside. But the idea of someone stepping through the gate, walking silently along the side of the house while we were still outside selling things, it settled into my chest in a way that didn't leave for the rest of the day. That night, around 11, my neighbor sent me a text. She had seen the same pickup parked near the corner after dark. Her security camera had caught the man walking along the side of my house with a flashlight, moving slowly, searching through the bushes like he'd dropped something, or was hoping to find something left behind. He didn't go near the front door. He didn't approach the windows where the lights were on. He stayed along the shadows, walking with purpose, stopping twice to point the beam toward the ground as if following the memory of a path. The police came the next morning. They watched the video with the same blank professionalism I'd expected. The man never looked at the camera. He kept his head angled down, the brim of his faded cap blocking most of his features. The pickup had no visible plates in the footage, just a blur of light when he drove away. They took a report, told me they'd patrol more frequently on my street for the next few days, but without a clear shot of his face they couldn't identify him. I replaced the basement window lock that afternoon, then added a second latch to the side gate and a motion light above it. Every night for the next week, I walked around the house once before bed, checking for footprints, checking the gate, checking the windows. Nothing showed up again. No truck, no flashlight, no figure moving in the shadows. What stayed with me wasn't the idea that he wanted the wallet itself. It was the look he kept giving the garage, like he believed something had once been hidden inside that old leather fold, and that we had taken it from him. Something he thought belonged to him. Something he was willing to come back for, even after dark, even after we believed he'd left for good. The wallet was still sitting where he had set it down when he came back the first time. I never saw it again after he drove off, and I still don't know what he thought had been inside. But every time I walk past the basement window, I think of the smudges on the glass, and the faint marks in the dirt from shoes that weren't mine. The kind of details you don't forget, even after the fear fades. The police never identified him, and the neighbor's footage was the last time anyone saw him near the house. But I haven't had a yard sale since. I don't think I ever will. I went to the community yard sale in Asheville on a warm Saturday morning in early June, the kind of day where the air feels soft and the sky looks washed clean after a night of light rain. The sale took up almost an entire block of a quiet neighborhood off Merriman Avenue, with tables set up on driveways and people walking around with coffee cups and tote bags. Most of the items were the usual mix of slightly worn clothes, old board games, mismatched kitchen tools, and boxes of paperbacks that had been in someone's attic for decades. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just liked digging through old things. Sometimes I found something interesting, and sometimes it was just a way to waste a few hours without feeling stuck inside. One of the tables near the far end caught my eye, because it had several old photo albums stacked in a neat pile. They were the thick kind with plastic sleeves and yellowing edges, the covers wrapped in faded vinyl. I flipped through the first few and they were exactly what I expected: family vacations, birthday parties, backyard barbecues, all from the 1970s or maybe early 80s. They felt warm and harmless, like stepping into a stranger's memories. The man running the table looked distracted as he rearranged a box of books. A woman who seemed like his wife sat on a folding chair behind him, scrawling on her phone. A small sign said everything on the table came from a deceased relative's house they were cleaning out. I picked one album at random, heavier than the others, with a forest green cover. When I flipped it open, the first pages showed a family of 5 at the beach, the colors washed out but still cheerful. Kids building sandcastles, a man grilling hot dogs, a woman holding a sun hat against the wind. I didn't study them too closely, just enough to see it fit the same era as the others. I didn't need another reason. I bought it for $3, tucked it into my tote bag, and wandered a little longer before heading home. I didn't look at it again until late afternoon. The house was quiet and the air inside had that still feeling it gets on hot days when the windows are closed. I sat on the couch with a cold drink and opened the album again, flipping through the early pages more slowly. There were camping trips in the mountains, kids in matching pajamas at Christmas, a birthday cake shaped like a train, all in that hazy vintage film look. Nothing unusual. Nothing to hint at what came later. When I turned to a page near the middle, the change hit instantly. Instead of smiling family members, the first photo on the new page showed a group of kids walking down a sidewalk, their backpacks slung low on their shoulders. The picture looked like it had been taken from behind a row of bushes, or maybe through the branches of a low tree. It wasn't part of any family gathering or vacation. It felt like something no one was supposed to take. I turned to the next one. A zoomed-in shot of a playground. Children on swings, a couple of them blurred from motion. The angle suggested someone standing far back, hidden. The next photo showed a woman getting into her car, balancing a bag of groceries in one hand. The distance was too far to make out her face, but the photo felt wrong in a way that made my stomach tighten. I tried to tell myself maybe the person who took the pictures was experimenting with film or angles, or maybe working on some kind of photography project. But the way the shots were taken didn't look like practice. They looked like surveillance. The next few photos got worse. One showed a kid sitting alone at a bus stop, his hands in his lap. Another was of a group of teenagers cutting across a grassy field. The camera positioned low behind a fence, as if the photographer had crouched down to stay out of sight. Every photo carried a feeling of someone watching others without their knowledge, studying ordinary moments from a distance. I kept flipping through them slowly, my fingers shaking a little even though the room was warm. Near the end of the album, the photos became less frequent, like whoever took them had slowed down or become more careful. Then I reached the last page. There was only one photo inside the plastic sleeve. It was a picture of a house, slightly tilted, like whoever took it was crouched or leaning behind something. The photo was centered on the front porch and the left side windows. I stared at it for a long time before the details sank in. The paint color was lighter back then, and the shrubs along the walkway were smaller, but the shape was the same. The porch railing had the same design. The front steps were the exact same number. It was my house. I pulled the photo out and turned it over. Someone had written a date on the back in small, neat handwriting. June 4th, 2003. That was years before I ever lived there, before I ever even visited Asheville. The idea that someone had been watching this house long before I owned it felt like the floor underneath me shifted. The air in the living room suddenly felt too hot, and the album felt heavier than it should. I set it aside, grabbed my keys, and drove straight back to the yard sale. By the time I got there, only a few tables were still open. The same family was at the table where I'd bought the album. I told them, without using names or accusing anyone, what had been inside, and they both looked genuinely confused. They said all the albums came from the uncle's storage boxes, and they assumed everything inside was just old vacation material. They said they'd never gone through them page by page. They seemed more embarrassed than anything else, insisting they had no idea. I believed them. The reaction didn't feel rehearsed. It felt like a mistake they had no way of knowing about. When I got home, I didn't want the album anywhere near me. I walked it out to the trash bin behind the house and tossed it in, making sure it was buried under a bag of yard clippings. I stood there for a while, listening to the distant traffic and a neighbor's dog barking, trying to calm the feeling that something had shifted inside my day in a way I couldn't put back. For a while I tried to forget about it. I told myself the photos were probably old and had nothing to do with my life now. Whoever took them was probably dead or long gone. The house might have meant something to them once, or maybe it didn't mean anything at all and was just another random place they photographed. I tried to break the connection in my mind, to make it smaller and less personal. But it didn't stay that way. I started noticing a man around downtown Asheville from time to time. Tall, older, thin, always wearing a heavy jacket even on warm days. I couldn't say he was the same man from the earliest photos, because those pictures were too grainy and distant to make out a face. But something about the posture, the way he stood back from crowds or leaned against walls in shadowed areas, made my mind jump to the connection before I could stop it. I saw him near a bus stop once while I was driving home. He was turned away, staring at a group of teenagers waiting for their ride, not interacting with anyone. Another time I saw him crossing a street near Pack Square, moving slowly as if he had nowhere to be but wanted to watch everything around him. I told myself I was just imagining the connection because the album had unsettled me. There was no reason to think he had anything to do with it. Asheville had plenty of older men who kept to themselves and wandered around. Still, every time I saw him, the same uneasy pressure built in my stomach. One afternoon, several weeks after the yard sale, I walked past a coffee shop downtown and saw him sitting at an outdoor table alone. He wasn't drinking anything. He wasn't reading. He was just sitting with his hands folded, looking at people passing by. I felt the same reaction I had when I saw the photo of my house. The sudden tightening in my chest, the sensation of something old and unwanted resurfacing. I kept walking and tried to steady my breathing. That night, I stood on my front porch after sunset, listening to the usual neighborhood sounds. The faint hum of cars, the soft rustle of leaves, someone mowing their backyard even though it was nearly dark. My house looked normal, calm, the porch light casting a warm glow across the steps. But I couldn't stop thinking about that photo from 2003. Someone had stood somewhere near where I was standing now, lined up that same angle, and taken a picture for reasons I would probably never know. I reminded myself of the obvious truth: I had lived here for years without any problems. No strange events, no signs of anyone watching. The photo was old, the man downtown probably a random stranger, and the whole thing was more unsettling because of the surprise, not because of any real ongoing threat. I needed to accept that the past belonged to someone I never knew and wasn't connected to anymore. As the porch light flickered slightly from a bug hitting the bulb, I made a decision I fully meant to keep. I wouldn't go looking for answers. I wouldn't try to connect dots that might not be connected at all. If the man downtown happened to be someone from those old photos, then whatever he was doing in 2003 had nothing to do with me now. He didn't know me, and I didn't know him. The album was gone. The photos were gone. The past was sealed off. From then on, whenever I saw someone who reminded me of that man, I let the moment pass without staring. I let the sensation rise and fade. Eventually, the sightings became less common, and the uneasy feeling softened into something manageable, just a memory I could look at from a distance without letting it reshape my days. The house became just my house again. The porch, the windows, the steps, nothing more than the place I lived and returned to every night. If someone had once watched it from a distance, that story belonged to a life I had nothing to do with. My life continued in the present, grounded in the routine of work, errands, and the simple comfort of coming home to a quiet place that felt safe. The photo album never came back to mind with the same sharpness after that. It faded into something I could file away, not as a threat, but as an unsettling piece of someone else's history that ended the moment I threw it away. I was driving east on Highway 49 late on a Saturday morning, the kind of humid Gulfport day where the sky looks washed out even when there are no clouds. I had no real plans and nowhere particular to be, but I'd been trying to distract myself from the restless feeling that always hits me on weekends. I saw a small hand-painted yard sale sign stuck into the ground near a gravel driveway, the kind made from a piece of old cardboard with thick black marker letters. It pointed toward a house set back from the road, half hidden behind a row of scraggly pine trees. I slowed down without really thinking about it, turned onto the narrow drive, and felt my tires crunch over loose gravel and dried pine needles. The place looked normal enough at first glance. A single-story house with faded white siding, a sagging carport on the left, and a patchy yard where someone had made a half-hearted effort to mow. A few folding tables were set up near the front, covered with the usual yard sale mix: old Christmas decorations, chipped kitchenware, clothes stacked in uneven piles, and a cardboard box full of rusty tools. The air smelled like hot pavement and cut grass, with a faint hint of something metallic carrying from the open windows of the house. A girl stood behind one of the tables. She looked young, maybe early 20s, with her hair tied back in a messy bun and a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. She kept her arms close to her body like she was trying not to take up any space. Her eyes moved constantly, not in the casual way someone might check for new customers, but in short, sharp glances toward the front door of the house. Every time a car slowed on the highway, she stiffened slightly, like noise alone could set off some kind of chain reaction. I stepped out of my car and walked up to the tables, trying not to give too much thought to how off her body language felt. Yard sales can be awkward anyway. Sometimes people look tense just because they hate bargaining or feel weird about strangers picking through their old things. I told myself that was all it was. I reached down and picked up a box of tools. Rusty wrenches, a couple of screwdrivers with cracked handles, a dented measuring tape. They were the kind of things I didn't need but might buy anyway if the price was right. That was when I noticed how quiet it was. Not silence exactly. Cars still went by on the highway, and cicadas buzzed in the trees. But there was something missing. No radio playing, no dogs barking, no normal background noise from inside the house. Just a blank, heavy quiet that made the whole place feel like it was holding its breath. The girl moved slightly closer, stopping about an arm's length from me. Her eyes didn't go to the tools. They stayed locked on mine for a moment, wide and nervous. Her shoulders tightened as if she had to force herself to speak. When she did, her voice was low, almost swallowed by the open space around us. She didn't look like she was trying to make small talk. She looked like she was trying to warn me about something without being seen doing it. I didn't understand at first. The heat had me sweating already, and I thought maybe she was just overwhelmed by having to run the sale alone. But then I saw her glance toward the front door again, and the fear in her expression made my stomach sink. It wasn't something dramatic or exaggerated. It was a tired, worn-down fear, the kind that comes from living with something for a long time and knowing exactly how bad it can get. Her hands were shaking slightly, even though she kept them pressed against her hips. Before I could figure out what to do, the screen door slammed open. The sound was so sharp and sudden that I jumped. A man stepped out onto the front porch with the hard, heavy movements of someone who hadn't slept well and was already in a bad mood. He was barefoot, wearing only a pair of dark sweatpants, and his chest looked red like he'd been pacing around inside. His hair was unkempt, and his jaw was clenched in a way that made his face look almost swollen with tension. He stared straight at me as if I had done something deliberately wrong just by being there. There was no mistaking the hostility in his expression. It wasn't confusion or curiosity. It was accusation, sharp and immediate. His eyes flicked to the box of tools in my hands, then back to my face. The air between us felt charged, like a rubber band pulled as far as it could stretch. The girl didn't move, but I saw the way her posture collapsed inward, as though she knew exactly what his mood meant. He came down the steps quickly, not running but moving with the kind of force that made it clear he didn't care if he scared people. His feet hit the ground hard, and bits of gravel shifted under his heels. When he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped only a few feet from me. His stare didn't break even for a second. There was something unsettling in the way he held himself. Shoulders tense, chest forward, fists loose at his sides like he was choosing whether to clench them. I realized then that the girl had been watching him the entire time, not me. She wasn't worried about customers or heat or anything normal. She was afraid of him. It was written all over her face, and it made the back of my neck prickle. The atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous in an instant. Standing there with the box of tools, I felt a strange combination of intrusion and vulnerability. I was just someone stopping at a yard sale, doing something ordinary, but now I was part of whatever was happening inside that house. I didn't want to push back or question anything. I didn't want to be there at all. I felt the girl's eyes on me again, and although she didn't say anything, her expression told me what she needed me to do. I set the box down exactly where I had picked it up. I didn't try to browse anything else or pretend I was just leaving casually. The whole place felt charged with tension, and I didn't want to give the man any reason to escalate whatever was already festering beneath the surface. As I stepped backward, putting more distance between us, I caught the girl looking at me with a tight, almost desperate kind of urgency. Her lips moved without sound, a clear, sharp gesture. It was all the confirmation I needed. Leaving felt like stepping out of a storm even though the weather hadn't changed. My hands were trembling slightly as I unlocked my car door. I avoided looking back at the house until I was inside with the engine running. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, the man was still standing in the same spot staring. The girl had retreated to the table, but she wasn't adjusting anything or moving items around. She just stood there, rigid and small, like she was trying to disappear into the background. I drove away faster than I meant to, my pulse still pounding from the tension that had filled the yard. Even once I merged back onto the highway, I kept checking my mirrors, irrationally expecting to see someone following me. The heat outside didn't help. Sweat trickled down my back, and my shirt clung to my skin. But the unease wasn't about the weather anymore. It was the look in the girl's eyes. The way she seemed trapped even in broad daylight. All afternoon and well into the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried distracting myself with chores and small tasks around the house, but every time I paused for even a second, my mind went back to that tense yard and the silent plea written across the girl's face. I wondered how long she had been living like that. How many people had stopped by and noticed the same thing, but convinced themselves it wasn't their business. I felt guilty for leaving so quickly, even though I knew staying would have only made things worse. The next evening, I turned on the local news while making dinner. A story came on about a domestic incident on a property off Highway 49. The address sounded familiar immediately. The screen showed the same faded white house, the same gravel driveway, and the same cluttered tables still standing in the yard. According to the report, the girl had been hospitalized after a violent altercation inside the home. The man had been taken into custody. I turned the volume up even though I already knew what I was hearing. The reporter described injuries, police statements, and a history of previous calls to the residents. I heard none of it clearly. My focus stayed on the small, blurred clip of the girl being assisted into an ambulance, her face pale and unfocused. Even without sound, I recognized the expression she'd worn the day before. In that moment, the atmosphere from the yard sale returned with full force. The heavy quiet, the sharp movements, the uneasy glances. Everything made sense in a way I wished it didn't. I realized she hadn't just been scared. She had been waiting for something to happen, or trying to prevent something from happening, and I had walked right into the middle of it without understanding the weight of it. I kept watching until the report ended, but nothing eased the tight feeling in my chest. The story was clear, the details laid out, and there was no mystery or loose thread left hanging. Yet the image of her standing behind that table stayed with me. Not because she asked for help or tried to draw attention, but because she did the opposite. She tried to protect herself and anyone else who wandered into her situation the only way she felt she could. For weeks afterward, every time I drove past a yard sale sign or saw a folding table set up in someone's driveway, I felt a small jolt of unease. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that even the most ordinary situations can hide things you don't expect. I thought about how easily I could have brushed off her urgency or mistaken it for simple anxiety. How many people had ignored it before me? What stayed with me more than anything else was the look in her eyes right before I left. It wasn't just fear. It was exhaustion. A plea wrapped in silence. The kind of expression that lingers long after you've walked away. I still think about her when I pass that stretch of Highway 49. The tables are gone now. The yard is empty. The house looks the same from the road, but the place feels different, like the tension has drained out of the air around it. But whenever I drive by, I slow down just long enough to glance at the property and remember the weight of that brief moment. The girl had been living with that fear every day, and I had seen only a single snapshot of it. That single moment was enough to stay with me. Enough to remind me that not everything you stumble into is harmless. Enough to make me realize how much a stranger's quiet warning can carry. I bought the metal trunk on a Saturday morning in Citrus Heights. The kind of slow, warm morning where the sun already felt heavy even before noon. The yard sale sat in front of a single-story beige house with faded shutters and patchy grass. A few plastic tables were set up on the driveway with the usual mix of old kitchen supplies, holiday decorations coated in dust, and piles of paperback books with curled covers. The trunk sat off to the side near the garage door like it had been dragged out at the last minute. It was heavier than it looked, scratched along the edges, and had two steel latches with a third latch in the center that was still locked. The seller, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, said they didn't have the key and that it probably had blankets or junk inside. She didn't sound like she cared much about it. I gave her $20 and lifted it into my trunk with both hands, surprised by the dense weight inside. When I got home, I carried it into the garage and set it down near my workbench. The garage was warm and dim, the kind of light that made everything look older. The metal trunk left a smear of dust on my palms. I tried to shake it gently, but nothing shifted. Whatever was inside was packed tightly. I found a flathead screwdriver and tried the latches first, pressing up under the locked one. After a few minutes of pushing and tapping at the hinge with a small hammer, the lock finally snapped off. The sound echoed off the garage walls louder than I expected. I lifted the lid, expecting maybe a stack of old quilts or outdated clothes. Instead, I saw a neat stack of envelopes bound together with brittle rubber bands. The letters were yellowed around the edges, and all addressed to the same person, someone I didn't recognize. The name wasn't the name of the woman who sold it to me. The address on each envelope matched the house where I'd bought the trunk, but every envelope had a red stamp printed diagonally across the front. Return to sender. I sat on a stool and pulled the envelopes out one by one. Some were slightly bent, some had worn corners, but none had been opened. They were all from the same person, the same handwriting, the same neat loops and narrow spacing. The postmarks ranged across several years. I felt a strange tightness in my chest as I realized whoever wrote these had sent dozens of letters that were never received, or maybe never accepted. Under the letters, wrapped in a crinkled grocery bag, was a bundle of printed emails. The pages had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were nearly torn through. I flattened them against my workbench and scanned the contents. It didn't take long to understand what I was looking at. The emails described a restraining order filed in 2011. The back and forth messages referenced court dates, required distances, and warnings about continued contact. The language was firm and procedural, but the tension behind it was obvious. At the bottom of the pile was a single photograph printed on cheap computer paper. It showed a woman in a parking garage. The picture was taken from far back, zoomed in so tightly that the pixels were visible, She was walking fast, head turned, eyes wide. The expression on her face was unmistakable. She knew she was being watched. I stared at the photo longer than I meant to, feeling the same heat from the garage settling deep in my stomach. I kept imagining the moment the picture was taken, the photographer hidden somewhere behind a concrete pillar, standing still until she looked back. I couldn't understand why all of this had been stuffed into a trunk and sold at a yard sale. It didn't feel like forgotten junk. It felt intentional, like someone had tried to bury it somewhere they hoped no one would dig. I packed everything back carefully, closed the trunk, and drove the whole thing to the Citrus Heights police station. It felt strange walking through the glass doors with that metal trunk in my arms, but I explained what I had found and left it all with them. They took my name and number and said they would handle it. No one contacted me again. I assumed they would reach out if they needed anything, and I figured silence meant it was something they classified, sorted, and passed along to wherever things like that go. I tried not to think too much about it. 2 weeks passed. The nights were still warm, and I kept the windows cracked to let air in. Nothing felt strange during those days. No odd cars on the street, no strange calls, nothing that made me think about the trunk again. I worked, came home, handled my normal routine. The memory of the letters faded a little, the way unsettling things sometimes do when regular life pushes back in. Then, on a Thursday night around 10:30, someone knocked on my front door. It wasn't a loud knock, but it was steady, 3 taps spaced almost evenly. I had just turned off the living room lights and was heading toward my bedroom. The knock froze me. I rarely got visitors that late. I walked quietly to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. His posture was stiff and angled forward like he was waiting for a reaction. His right hand rested on the metal trunk, the same trunk I had given to the police. The lid was open, empty, the interior dark enough that it looked deeper than it was. My chest tightened in a way that felt like a warning. I didn't open the door. I didn't say anything. I backed away and went straight to my bedroom to grab my phone. I called the police and kept my voice low, explaining what I had seen. They told me to stay inside. I stayed in the dark hallway, waiting for sirens. The man stayed on the porch for several long minutes. He didn't knock again. He didn't call out. He just stood there, hands resting on the edges of the empty trunk, head slightly tilted like he was listening for movement inside the house. Then, without any hurry, he lifted the trunk with both hands and walked off into the shadows near the sidewalk. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. By then the street was completely empty. They drove around, checked the side yards and the back gate, but found nothing. One officer asked a few quiet questions about the trunk and the man's appearance. I answered everything I could, but I didn't have much detail. The baseball cap had hidden most of his face. After a while they told me they'd file a report and patrol the area through the night. They left around midnight. I barely slept. Every sound in the house felt sharper than usual. The air conditioner clicking on made me jump. By morning I was exhausted enough to feel numb. I called the police station again later that afternoon and asked if they had any updates. They said there was no new information and that the case was still open. I started checking the locks twice before bed. I began keeping the curtains closed even during the day. I installed a motion light on the porch the following weekend. None of it made me feel much better, but it gave me something to do with the restless energy sitting under my ribs. About a week later I received a call from the investigating officer. They had looked into the original addresses on the letters, the names tied to the restraining order, and the property records for the house where I bought the trunk. The police hadn't found the man who wrote the letters. He had moved out of California in 2012 and had no recent ties to Citrus Heights. The woman named in the restraining order hadn't lived at that address in over a decade, and had legally changed her name years ago, before relocating out of state. There was no indication she had ever returned to the area. The officer said the man at my door was likely not the writer of the letters. According to them, the real letter writer would be much older now and had a documented history that didn't match the appearance I described. The officer believed the man on my porch was someone who had gained access to the trunk after I turned it over, possibly through mishandling or internal transfer error. His motive wasn't clear, but the officer assured me they were adding extra patrols at night and that they recommended installing a security camera just to be safe. Over the next several nights, nothing happened. No knocks, no shadows near the windows, no sign of the trunk returning again. Part of me kept replaying the moment I opened the lid in my garage, wondering if the man thought I had kept something from it, or if he felt I had crossed a boundary by looking through those letters at all. But another part of me understood something else. The trunk wasn't about its contents anymore. It was about who had carried them, protected them, obsessed over them. Whatever story began in those letters hadn't ended when I turned them in. It had just shifted, changing hands one more time. I put up the security camera. I checked the feed every night for the first week. Eventually, I checked only in the mornings. Nothing ever showed up. No figures on the porch, no trunk, no late night watchers. The street returned to its familiar quiet rhythm, but I kept the porch light on every night after that. Even in summer when it barely got dark before midnight. Even after months passed without incident. I didn't tell many people about the trunk, and I avoided yard sales for a long time. I learned how easily someone else's unfinished story can spill into your life, carried in something as simple as a metal box with a broken lock. And I learned that some things, once opened, can't ever be completely closed again.